The night was still except for the soft rustle of wind brushing through the tall pines. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, sending tiny sparks upward like stars breaking free from the earth. Inside the rough-hewn log cabin, the scent of wood smoke and wild sage lingered. The place was small, built sturdy against the harsh winds of the frontier, but its walls held a quiet tension that could be felt even in the silence. A young woman stood near the fire, her hands tight around a cast-iron pan. Her dress was plain, a bit frayed at the edges, but her eyes held a quiet strength that didn't match her fragile frame. She had journeyed far, farther than anyone had thought possible for someone like her, and now she stood in a land where each choice could mean survival or ruin. Across from her stood a tall Apache warrior, his presence commanding yet calm. The firelight danced over the lines of his face and the beads around his neck. He watched her with the sharpness of a hawk, studying every movement she made. He had found her near the river 2 nights earlier, cold and hungry, clutching a bundle of belongings that told little of who she was. She didn't speak much, only enough to show she meant no harm. Still, in this land, trust was rare and hard-earned. His people were wary of settlers, but something about her made him pause before deciding her fate. The frontier had a way of stripping people down to their raw selves. Out here, there were no grand titles or safe walls to hide behind. There was only grit, instinct, and the quiet pull of survival. She had come from a distant settlement, one swallowed by drought and hardship. Stories of Apache lands had drifted through her town like wind-blown rumors. Most spoke of danger, of raids and untamed warriors. But she had also heard whispers of fertile valleys, rivers that never ran dry, and a life unshackled from the chains of the East. Desperation had led her here, but now that she stood before him, every breath felt heavier. The firelight caught her face as she lifted her chin slightly, steadying her trembling hands. "I can cook," she said, her voice soft but clear. It was a fragile offering, but it was all she had. In this world, a skill like that could keep you alive. Her words hung in the air between them, simple yet charged with meaning. She didn't know his language fully, but he understood enough. His dark eyes narrowed just a little, not in anger, but in something deeper. Curiosity, perhaps even a stirring he didn't expect. He stepped closer, and the space between them grew warm and tense. She didn't back away, though her heart thudded like a drum in her chest. The Apache was tall, his posture proud, his movements measured like someone who had learned to be cautious in every breath. The firelight flickered against his skin, throwing shadows across the cabin walls. She gripped the pan tighter, though not as a weapon, more like an anchor holding her in place. Outside, the distant howl of a coyote cut through the night, reminding them both of the untamed world just beyond the door. This cabin was a small pocket of uncertain peace in a wild land. Neither truly belonged here together, yet fate had drawn their paths to cross. He had saved her from the riverbank out of duty, perhaps, or maybe because something in her face had reminded him of a story his elders used to tell about strangers who changed destinies. She could feel his gaze like the warmth of the fire itself. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, carrying the weight of his people's tongue. "Stay," he said, drawing closer. "You're my breath of life." The words were unexpected, almost poetic, and they sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She didn't know if he meant them fully or if it was a fragment of translation, but the sincerity in his tone left no doubt of his intent. Her thoughts raced. Was this safety or the beginning of a new kind of danger? She didn't know his customs or what stay truly meant in his world, but in her heart something stirred. She had run from hunger and fear, from a place that had no future. Now standing before him, she felt seen in a way she hadn't before. The flames crackled louder, as if the fire itself held its breath, waiting for her answer. Behind them, the log walls groaned softly under the weight of the night wind. A few embers broke loose from the hearth, spiraling upward before fading into ash. She imagined the road that had led her here, dusty trails, endless horizons, the ache of loss with every step. She had thought her story would end by the riverbank, another nameless soul lost to the wild. Instead, she had found a man whose eyes held a strength she couldn't explain, a man who spoke words that made her chest tighten in a way both frightening and comforting. He reached out slowly, not to touch but to motion toward the pan she held. It was his way of saying he accepted her offer. Food in this land was more than sustenance. It was a bridge, a gesture of trust. She nodded, swallowing hard, and turned toward the fire. Her hands moved almost on instinct, mixing what little she had brought with the ingredients he offered. Wild roots, dried meat, a pinch of herbs she didn't recognize. The rhythm of cooking calmed her, reminded her of home, though this place was anything but. As the scent of cooking filled the cabin, the air between them softened slightly, though the tension didn't vanish. It shifted into something new, unspoken but alive. He watched her every move, not with suspicion now but with a quiet reverence, as if he was witnessing something rare. She had stepped into his world, unsure of what awaited her, and he had opened his door to someone unlike anyone he'd known. The sound of horses outside broke the fragile stillness. He stiffened, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his waist. Her eyes widened, sensing the sudden change in him. Shadows moved beyond the window, faint but unmistakable. The wilderness didn't sleep, and danger often came without warning. She froze, pan halfway to the fire, heart pounding. Whoever was outside hadn't knocked, hadn't called. That silence spoke volumes. He signaled her to stay quiet, his body shifting into the poised stillness of a hunter ready to defend his ground. The fire popped sharply, and both their heads turned toward the door. The night that had seemed so still moments ago now felt charged with unseen eyes. Her fingers tightened on the handle of the pan again, though she knew it was a flimsy weapon against whatever waited outside. He stepped toward the door without a sound, every movement smooth and deliberate. She watched him, realizing in that moment how far she was from everything she had once known. The land outside that door was fierce, and so was the life that awaited her here. Her offer to cook had been simple, but it had tethered her to a path she couldn't easily step away from now. The horses snorted, restless. A low voice called out in a language she didn't understand, but he did. His shoulders tensed. He glanced back at her for the briefest moment, and in his eyes she saw a mix of resolve and something protective. The fire cast long shadows against the walls, wrapping them both in its flickering glow. She didn't know who was outside or what they wanted, but she sensed that the next few moments would decide everything. The night held its breath. The young woman stood in that small cabin, fragile yet determined. A stranger in a world that was about to test her in ways she couldn't imagine. The Apache warrior reached for the latch. Whatever came through that door would change their lives forever. The door opened slowly with a soft creak, and a gust of cold night air swept inside, carrying with it the scent of pine, smoke, and distant rain. The warrior stood tall in the doorway, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight's reach. 3 riders emerged from the shadows, their horses shifting restlessly on the damp earth. The riders wore deerskin and carried the quiet authority of men who belonged to this land. They spoke in low, firm tones in their language, words that flowed like the wind through canyon walls. She didn't understand them, but she could feel the weight of their conversation. The warrior answered with equal steadiness, his voice low but sharp, and she sensed the tension deepen rather than fade. The men dismounted, their footsteps soft against the ground. One of them carried a bow, another held a bundle wrapped in animal hide, and the third, older and with deep lines etched across his face, walked as if every movement carried history. They glanced at her briefly, their expressions unreadable, then turned back to the warrior. She felt the urge to shrink into the shadows, but she stayed where she was, near the fire, clutching the pan like a lifeline. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she watched the exchange unfold. The warrior finally stepped back and gestured for them to enter. The men crossed the threshold, bringing the scent of the night with them. They gathered around the fire, speaking among themselves while the warrior listened. The older man's voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in insistence. The warrior responded in measured tones, his jaw tightening at certain words. She couldn't understand the meaning, but she could read their faces. Something was being questioned. Something about her presence wasn't sitting easily with them. She wondered if they were his kin, his leaders, or perhaps scouts from his village. She had stepped into their world as an outsider, and her being here must have raised questions. She had heard stories back in her settlement of Apache councils, of decisions made not by one but by the wisdom of many. It made sense that they wouldn't accept her without scrutiny. She swallowed hard and kept her gaze steady, even as their eyes occasionally flicked back to her. The warrior finally turned to her and spoke slowly in broken English, trying to bridge the gap between their worlds. "They ask who you are," he said, pointing lightly toward her chest, then motioning to the forest beyond. "Why you here?" His voice wasn't accusing. It was careful, as if he was placing each word like a stone across a river. She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Her journey had been long and painful, and the memories of what she had left behind pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. "I came from east," she began softly, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier. "No food, no water. The land turned dry. People left. I followed the river. I had nowhere else to go. She gestured toward the door, toward the night beyond, hoping her simple words would carry the truth. The older man studied her intently, his eyes sharp as if weighing the honesty of her story. The warrior translated her words to them, his tone steady, though she caught the flicker of doubt in their eyes. One of the younger men said something quickly, his gaze narrowing. The warrior's response was firm, almost protective, and the younger man's jaw tightened. The older man raised a hand to quiet them, then spoke again with calm authority. It was clear he was the one whose word carried weight. Finally, they fell silent, waiting for his decision. He turned to her one last time, his gaze like steel, then nodded slowly. Whatever judgment he passed, it wasn't outright rejection, but it wasn't full acceptance either. It was something in between, a cautious allowance. Then, as quietly as they had arrived, the men stepped back into the night, mounted their horses, and disappeared into the darkness. The door closed, and silence filled the cabin once more. The warrior stood for a moment, his back to her, shoulders tense. When he finally turned, his expression softened slightly, though the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. "They watch," he said simply. "They wait." His eyes met hers, and she understood. She wasn't truly safe yet. Her presence here was like a spark in dry grass. It could catch flame or die out depending on the winds of the days ahead. She turned back to the fire, stirring the food that had nearly burned while the visitors were inside. Her hands moved automatically, though her mind raced. She thought of the settlement she'd left behind. Drought had come slowly at first, then like a thief, taking everything in silence. Crops failed, animals grew thin, and wells dried up until the ground cracked like broken pottery. Families had split apart in search of better lands, but most found only dust. She had stayed as long as she could, clinging to the hope that rain would return, that someone would fix what had gone wrong. But when her younger brother had fallen sick and passed under the relentless sun, she knew she couldn't stay any longer. Her journey west had been filled with hunger, fear, and nights where the stars were her only companions. Now, here in this cabin with a man whose world was unlike hers, she felt both fragile and strangely anchored. He moved to the fire, sitting cross-legged like it was his natural place. His presence filled the room, steady and unyielding. He didn't ask her more questions, but she could feel his curiosity, like quiet ripples beneath still water. She wondered what he thought of her, a lost woman with nothing but a pan and the promise of a skill that might keep her useful. Outside, the night grew heavier. The wind picked up, pressing against the walls as if testing their strength. She glanced toward the door, half expecting the riders to return. Instead, there was only the sound of distant thunder rolling across the horizon. A storm was coming. In the frontier, storms were more than weather. They were trials. They tested every weakness in wood, bone, and soul. He spoke again, this time softer. "My people, not trust easy," he said. "Many lies from white men, many pain." His voice carried a quiet edge, shaped by years of history she barely understood. She lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of truth she hadn't lived but could sense. She wasn't here to bring harm, but convincing them of that was another matter. "I understand," she whispered, meeting his gaze again. And in that moment something shifted between them. A thread, thin but real, began to weave itself through the silence. As the food finished cooking, she handed him a portion without a word. He accepted it with a nod, the simple act carrying more meaning than any grand speech. They ate in silence, the fire warming their faces while the storm edged closer. She could hear the rain beginning to patter against the roof, soft at first, then growing steadier. It was the kind of rain that would soak the land through, turning paths to mud and rivers wild. She wondered if this cabin was his alone, or if it belonged to his people. She wondered if she was meant to stay here for a night or longer. His earlier words lingered in her mind like a whisper. "Stay, you're my breath of life." She didn't fully understand them yet, but they echoed deep inside her. When the last embers of the fire began to dim, he stood and checked the door, securing it against the storm. She wrapped her shawl tighter around herself, listening to the rain's relentless rhythm. The tension from the riders' visit hadn't faded. It hung like a storm cloud over everything. She knew their return would come in some form. Acceptance in a land like this wasn't given freely. It was earned, tested, sometimes fought for. She lay on a bed of furs near the fire while he sat near the doorway, watchful even as the night grew late. The rain beat against the roof, and every distant crack of thunder seemed to shake loose old fears she thought she'd buried. Yet despite the unknowns ahead, she felt a strange sense of belonging beginning to root itself. The warrior hadn't turned her away. He had stood before his people and spoken on her behalf. That alone was more than she had expected. She closed her eyes, though sleep didn't come easily. Images of her old home of cracked earth and empty wells flickered in her mind, but alongside them were new images. The firelight dancing on his face, the intensity of his gaze, the storm outside and the fragile warmth within. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if his people would accept her, or if the storm outside was only the first of many to come. But for now, in this fragile moment, she was here and the world outside waited. The rain didn't let up by morning. It came down in steady sheets, turning the dirt paths outside into deep brown rivers and soaking the land until everything glistened under the gray sky. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low but steady, and the smell of wet earth drifted through the cracks in the walls. She sat near the hearth, her knees pulled close, listening to the rain while the warrior prepared his gear. His movements were silent but purposeful. He fastened his knife to his belt, checked his bowstring, and scanned the outside through a small slit in the wall. His eyes were sharp, as if he expected something to emerge from the fog. She had slept little. Each roll of thunder through the night had reminded her how far from her old world she had come. The rider's visit still sat heavy in her chest. Their silence had not been acceptance, only a temporary pause. She didn't know if they'd return with questions or with judgment. She could feel it. Her presence had stirred something in their community. She wasn't sure if it was curiosity, suspicion, or both. He finally spoke, his voice calm but serious. "I go to village," he said slowly, choosing each English word with care. "Talk, you stay, fire, safe." His eyes met hers for a moment, and she understood this was more than a request. It was a matter of trust. She nodded, though her stomach tightened at the thought of being left alone. "I'll stay," she replied softly. He studied her face for a heartbeat longer, then wrapped a hide cloak around his shoulders and slipped outside into the rain. The door closed behind him with a dull thud, leaving her in a silence that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. She fed more wood to the fire and tried to keep herself busy, but her thoughts kept drifting back to what might be happening in his village. She pictured the older man with the sharp eyes, the younger one who had questioned her, and the weight of their stares. She wondered what stories they told about settlers, what memories shaped their mistrust. The storm outside felt like a reflection of what brewed between their worlds, unpredictable, fierce, and ready to test every weakness. As the hours passed, the wind shifted. The rain eased slightly, turning into a steady drizzle. She decided to gather water from a barrel outside to keep herself moving. When she stepped out, the damp air hit her skin like a chill. The forest loomed around the cabin, dripping and alive. She filled the bucket quickly, glancing over her shoulder more than once. It wasn't fear of animals that made her uneasy. It was the sense of being watched. This land had eyes, and they weren't always kind. When she returned to the cabin, a faint movement near the tree line caught her attention. A figure stood half hidden among the pines, too far to make out clearly but close enough to send her heart racing. It didn't move toward her, just watched. She froze at the threshold, gripping the bucket tightly. After a tense moment, the figure turned and disappeared deeper into the woods. She stepped inside quickly and bolted the door. Whoever that had been wasn't a passing traveler. It felt deliberate, like a test. Later in the afternoon, he returned, his cloak soaked but his expression unreadable. He placed his bow against the wall and shook off the rain. She didn't speak at first, waiting for him to share what had happened. He finally sat by the fire, staring into the flames before speaking. "Some accept, some not," he said quietly. "Old ones say, remember the past. Many broken promises. They fear you bring more." His tone wasn't accusing but heavy with truth. She understood. The settlers' expansion had pushed against Apache lands for years. Treaties made and broken, land taken, lives changed. She couldn't blame them for being cautious. "Do they want me to leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. "They wait," he finally said. "They watch what you do, how you live." His eyes met hers, steady and searching. She realized her actions in the coming days would determine everything. This wasn't just about her survival. It was about trust that had been fractured long before she ever arrived. That night, they worked side by side to prepare food. She taught him a way to season dried meat using a mix of herbs she'd carried from her old home, and he showed her how to grind wild corn into fine meal. The rhythm of their work was quiet, almost natural, and for a few moments the storm outside and the weight of judgment faded, but the peace didn't last. The next morning the rain cleared, leaving the land slick and glistening. They ventured out together to check traps near the river. The air smelled fresh, but the ground squelched underfoot. As they moved through the forest, she noticed signs she hadn't seen before: broken branches, hoof prints in the mud, and faint smoke trails rising in the distance. He crouched down, examining the ground with the skill of someone who could read the land like a book. His expression darkened. "Not my people," he said softly. "Soldiers, maybe. Or traitors." His jaw clenched at the word soldiers. She felt a chill run through her. Soldiers in these lands often brought trouble. Sometimes they claimed to bring protection or law, but more often they came with demands, pushing further west, taking what they wanted. If soldiers were nearby, her presence might complicate things even more. To them, she would be a settler. To the Apache, she was an outsider. She belonged fully to neither world, caught between lines that were growing sharper by the day. They returned to the cabin with heavier hearts. He spoke little, but his silence carried meaning. That night, a group of Apache women and children approached the cabin cautiously. They didn't enter but stood at the edge of the clearing. One of the older women called out something to him in their language. He stepped outside to speak with them while she watched from the doorway. The women's eyes lingered on her, curious but wary. One little girl peeked from behind her mother's skirts, wide-eyed at the stranger in their midst. She felt a pull in her chest to bridge the gap. She stepped forward slowly, hands open. She spoke softly, introducing herself, though she knew they couldn't understand all her words. Still, her tone mattered. She offered a small loaf of bread she had baked earlier that day, warm and fragrant. The older woman accepted it with careful hands, sniffed it, then gave a slow nod. It wasn't a full embrace, but it was something. A fragile thread of connection, perhaps. When the group left, he returned with a thoughtful look. "They watch too," he said simply. "They tell stories. If you good, they tell good, if not." He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Stories traveled fast among his people. Her every move was being weighed and measured. As days turned into a quiet rhythm, tension simmered beneath the surface. Some villagers began to approach her cautiously, curious about her cooking and the way she adapted to their ways. She learned to fetch water from the river with a woven basket, to use herbs she'd never known existed, and to listen more than she spoke. Yet not everyone welcomed her presence. A group of younger warriors kept their distance, their eyes sharp with mistrust. She caught whispers when she walked through the edge of the village with him. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast the land in gold, a new sound shattered the calm. Gunshots echoed from the direction of the forest. Birds burst from the trees in a frenzy. The warrior stiffened instantly, grabbing his bow. She froze, her heart pounding. Gunfire didn't belong here, not this close. He signaled for her to stay back and slipped into the shadows, moving swiftly toward the sound. She stood at the doorway, gripping the frame, the memory of soldiers' hoofprints flashing in her mind. The sound of shouting followed, distant, but growing closer. She could make out the rough, clipped tones of English mixed with the sharper cadence of the Apache language. Her stomach twisted. Something had come to their doorstep, and it wasn't going away quietly. She wanted to run after him, but knew she'd only slow him down. All she could do was wait, listening to the clash of worlds unfolding just beyond the trees. The fire inside the cabin flickered low as the sky darkened. She stared into the flames, feeling the storm of uncertainty build again, not in the weather this time, but in the land itself. The fragile balance she had found here was shifting. Soldiers, suspicion, stories whispered through the village, each thread pulling tighter. She didn't know who would emerge from the forest when the shouting stopped. All she knew was that the conflict she had tried to outrun had found her once more, here at the edge of the wild frontier. The sound of gunfire echoed through the forest like distant thunder rolling closer with each passing moment. She stood in the doorway, frozen, her breath shallow and her heart hammering so hard it drowned out the patter of rain still dripping from the trees. The cabin that had once felt like a fragile shelter now seemed unbearably quiet. Every gust of wind against the walls made her flinch. The shouting continued, rising and falling in waves, English mixing with Apache words she couldn't fully understand. She pressed her palms to the rough wood of the doorframe, straining to hear if the warrior's voice was among them. But all she caught were bursts of anger and the crack of another rifle. Her mind spun through everything that had led to this moment. The rider's warning, the soldier's tracks by the river, the cautious acceptance of the village. None of it had settled before this storm arrived. She knew that if soldiers were truly near, they would see her not as a wanderer or a cook, but as one of their own. Someone who didn't belong among the Apache. That alone could ignite a fire no rain could put out. She moved back inside, shutting the door tightly. Her hands shook as she fed more wood to the fire, trying to keep it alive while the world outside seemed ready to break apart. She grabbed the pan, not as a weapon but as something familiar to hold. Something that reminded her of steadier times. She forced herself to breathe slowly, listening. Then, faint but clear, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Not the rhythmic gallop of riders attacking, but a slower, purposeful advance. Whoever was coming wasn't rushing. They were confident. She snuffed part of the fire to keep the glow from spilling too brightly through the window cracks, then crouched low, watching the doorway. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears as two horses emerged from the fog at the edge of the clearing. On them sat men in dark coats, rifles slung across their backs, faces partially hidden by wide-brimmed hats. Soldiers. She knew the look instantly, even from afar. They spoke to each other briefly, then one pointed toward the cabin. They dismounted and began to walk forward, mud splashing under their boots. Her throat tightened. If they found her here, what story would they tell? That she'd been taken? That she was a settler living among those they saw as enemies? She didn't have the power to control their narrative, and in this wild land, the wrong story could end lives. She glanced toward the forest, silently begging for him to appear. But the shouting had moved further west. He was caught up in whatever confrontation had begun, leaving her to face this alone. The soldiers reached the door and knocked sharply, their fists echoing through the cabin like hammer strikes. "Open up," one called. His voice was harsh, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. She stayed quiet, hoping they might move on. Another knock came, harder. "We know someone's in there," the second voice barked. She pressed her back against the wall, mind racing. If she opened the door, she risked betraying the trust she had built here. If she didn't, they might break it down, and that could bring even worse trouble to the Apache. Finally, she heard one of them mutter something, followed by the scrape of boots circling the cabin. They were checking for other ways in. Her pulse quickened. She had only moments to decide. In a rush of instinct, she grabbed a cloak and wrapped it tightly around herself, dimming her outline against the dark interior. She moved to the back corner where shadows gathered and waited. Through the slits in the wall, she could see one of the soldiers peering inside. His eyes narrowed as he tried to catch movement. The tension stretched like a wire ready to snap. Then, a distant sound broke through, the sharp whistle of an Apache signal. The soldiers paused, exchanging uneasy looks. Another whistle came, closer this time, followed by rustling in the trees. They raised their rifles, backs to the cabin, scanning the forest. She stayed still, hardly daring to breathe. The forest was alive with movement now, silent shapes shifting between trees. The soldiers began to retreat toward their horses, their confidence cracking as they realized they were being watched. Before they could mount, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was him. Bow drawn, eyes burning with a silent warning. The soldiers froze. The standoff hung in the air like lightning before a strike. She crept toward the window, watching. He spoke to them in English, his words clear and cold. "Leave." One soldier raised his rifle slightly and she felt her stomach twist. Any wrong move could ignite a fight none of them would walk away from. The second soldier tried to speak with forced authority. "We're not here to fight. We're here for her," he said, pointing toward the cabin. Her blood ran cold. "She's one of ours," he added. "You can't keep her." The warrior's bowstring tightened, his posture a living barrier between them and the cabin. His answer came steady. "She chooses," he said. "Not you." The soldiers exchanged glances, realizing the situation wasn't going to bend easily. One stepped forward slightly, trying to push his weight through words. "This doesn't end well if you don't cooperate," he warned. The forest answered with movement. Dozens of figures appeared silently among the trees, Apache warriors standing ready with bows and spears. The soldiers froze again, understanding the numbers they faced. The tension snapped tighter, every man waiting to see who would act first. The rain began again, soft at first, pattering on the leaves like a drumbeat beneath the standoff. She gripped the edge of the window, torn between fear and a strange, fierce resolve. These men weren't here to rescue her. They were here to claim her, to use her as a symbol, a reason to push deeper into Apache lands. She could see it in their eyes, calculating, not compassionate. Her presence had become a spark between two forces already on edge. The soldiers slowly lowered their rifles but didn't back away completely. "This isn't over," one said flatly. "Command will hear about this." They mounted their horses, casting one last hard look toward the cabin before disappearing down the trail. The forest grew quiet again, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that comes before something bigger breaks loose. He returned inside, his face hard and unreadable. Water dripped from his hair and shoulders, but his eyes were locked on hers. "They will come back," he said simply. She nodded, her hands still trembling. "They know I'm here," she whispered. "They'll bring more." He didn't deny it. Instead, he walked to the fire, adding wood as if grounding himself in the small act. "My people prepare," he said. "Some trust you. Some fear what follows you." The next days moved like storm clouds gathering. Scouts returned with news of soldiers setting up camp not far from the river. The village buzzed with quiet urgency. Warriors sharpened weapons, women gathered supplies, elders held long councils under the stars. She helped where she could, cooking for families, carrying water, trying to prove through action that she wasn't the danger they feared. But whispers followed her like a shadow. One evening, as she brought food to a group near the edge of the village, she overheard two young warriors speaking. Though their words were in their language, their tone and the glances they threw her way were sharp with doubt. One made a cutting motion across his throat, and though she didn't know the exact meaning, it chilled her. Not everyone wanted her to stay. Some believed removing her would remove the threat. The warrior who had taken her in grew more guarded, too. He spent long hours meeting with other leaders, his face set in quiet determination. She saw the weight he carried, not just for her but for his people, caught between defending their land and avoiding the spark of war. Sometimes at night she caught him watching the horizon, as if he could already see the flames that would come if soldiers returned in force. One night, as a dry wind swept through the trees, he returned from council later than usual. His expression was troubled. "Some say give you back," he said softly, not meeting her eyes at first. "They think soldiers leave if you go." Her heart twisted painfully. "And you?" she asked. He looked at her then, his gaze steady but heavy. "I say no. You hear by choice. You stay by choice." His words warmed and frightened her all at once. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She was a part of something larger, whether she wanted to be or not. The storm between the soldiers and the Apache was no longer distant. It was at their doorstep. She could feel it in the air, in the restless movements of the people, in the way nights grew quieter and watchfires burned longer. Her presence was a question neither side wanted to leave unanswered. And soon, that question would be forced into the open. The night before the inevitable confrontation, she couldn't sleep. She sat outside, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the stars above. The forest was still, holding its breath. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see him standing there, silent. He didn't speak, just sat beside her, the weight of what was coming resting between them like an unspoken vow. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew the moment was drawing near when everything would break. The first light of morning broke through the treetops, casting a pale glow over the clearing. Smoke from the watchfires hung low in the air, mingling with the mist rising from the ground. The night had been restless for everyone. Warriors had kept their silent watch, families had packed what they could, and the forest had felt alive with tension. She stood by the doorway, her hands clenched tightly around the edges of her shawl, watching as riders appeared on the horizon. Soldiers. Their formation was tight and deliberate, their movements slow but sure. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to make a point. The village gathered quietly behind the line of warriors. Children were pulled back toward the safety of the trees. Elders stood solemn and still, and every eye was fixed on the advancing soldiers. She could hear the low hum of the wind moving through the branches, a steady rhythm beneath the growing beat of horses' hooves. Beside her, he stood tall, his expression calm but alert, every muscle ready. She felt his presence like a steadying force, even as her stomach churned. When the soldiers finally stopped a few yards from the edge of the clearing, their leader rode forward. He was a stern man with weathered skin and sharp eyes that swept over the crowd before settling on her. "We've come for the woman," he said clearly. His voice carried the weight of command. "She is not your concern anymore," the warrior replied firmly. "She stays here." Murmurs spread through both sides like ripples across water. The leader's expression hardened. "You're harboring someone who belongs to the United States," he declared. "If you refuse to hand her over, you'll be considered hostile." The moment hung in the air, balanced between fragile peace and the edge of violence. She stepped forward before he could respond. Her legs felt weak, but her voice found strength she didn't know she had. "I'm not a prisoner," she said. "I chose to be here." The soldiers shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting her to speak. I won't go back with you, she continued, her voice steady despite the fear twisting inside her. I'm not your property. Her words sent a ripple through the village, a quiet breath of unity. The leader narrowed his eyes. You're making a mistake, he warned. They can't protect you from what's coming. She lifted her chin. Maybe not, she said. But this is where I belong now. The warrior moved slightly closer to her, not as a shield, but as a silent show of support. The leader glanced at the line of armed warriors, then back at her. His jaw tightened. He wasn't used to losing control of a situation. For a long moment, it seemed like the soldiers might push forward anyway. Hands hovered near triggers, bows were drawn tight, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between two forces waiting to see who would act first. But then the leader exhaled, a short, hard breath. He gave a signal to his men. Slowly, the soldiers lowered their rifles. This isn't over, he said, echoing his earlier warning. You've chosen your side. He turned his horse and began to ride away, the others following him in silence. The sound of their retreating hoofbeats faded slowly into the forest, leaving behind a heavy stillness. When the last rider disappeared beyond the trees, the villagers remained silent for several long moments. It wasn't victory in the way battles are usually won. It was something quieter, more fragile. A line had been drawn and both sides understood it. She let out the breath she'd been holding, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to fade. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a small but grounding gesture. They will talk, he said softly. More may come, she nodded. I know, she replied, but I won't run. In the days that followed, life slowly began to return to its rhythm, though it was a rhythm reshaped by everything that had happened. Scouts continued to watch the edges of the forest, ready for any signs of soldiers returning, but the tension eased. Families resumed their daily work, and children's laughter began to return to the village paths. She found herself once again in the heart of it all, cooking, gathering, sharing in their routines. People who had once regarded her with suspicion now greeted her with cautious warmth. The quiet strength she had shown during the standoff had earned their respect in a way words alone never could. The warrior's leadership was tested, but his decision to protect her had strengthened his position among his people. The elders spoke with him often, their respect clear. She watched these moments with a sense of gratitude and awe. She had come to this place a stranger, unsure of her place in the world, and now she stood as part of something larger than herself. The soldiers had not returned immediately, perhaps reconsidering the cost of pushing further. For now, peace held, fragile but real. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in warm gold and rose, she sat outside the cabin watching the light fade. The warrior joined her, sitting quietly beside her. Neither spoke for a while. The sounds of the village at dusk were gentle, the soft chatter of families, the crackle of cooking fires, the distant laughter of children playing. It was a far cry from the fear that had once filled these woods. You could have gone, he said finally. His voice was calm, almost curious. You could have chosen them. She turned to look at him. I didn't belong with them anymore, she said. Here I found something real. I found people who gave me a place when I had nowhere else to go. He nodded, his gaze turning back toward the fading light. Then you stay, he said simply. Her heart settled into a quiet certainty. The future was uncertain, but for the first time she wasn't afraid of it. The forest, the village, and the people had become part of her story. She knew challenges would come. The soldier's warning had not been empty, and the world beyond the trees would not simply forget. But she also knew that she wouldn't face it alone. She had chosen this life, and it had chosen her back. As weeks turned into months, the rhythm of daily life continued to shape her. She learned more of their language, their customs, and their way of living with the land rather than against it. Her cooking became a small bridge between two worlds, blending what she had known with what she was learning. She found meaning in the quiet tasks, in the shared laughter around fires, in the steady strength of those who had welcomed her despite everything. The soldiers never returned in force that season. Perhaps they realized the cost of trying to control something they didn't understand. Or perhaps they were simply waiting. Either way, the village prepared, but they lived. And in that living, they found a strength that no army could take away. She often thought about the day she had first arrived, tired and uncertain, and how far she had come since then. The journey had tested her in ways she hadn't imagined, but it had also revealed who she truly was. Standing at the edge of the river one crisp morning, watching the water flow steadily toward distant lands, she felt a deep sense of peace. Life was never about perfect endings. It was about the choices made in moments that defined who you became. She had chosen to stand her ground, to protect what mattered, and to build a life where she was more than just a name in someone else's story. This place, these people, had become her home. The warrior joined her at the river's edge, his presence quiet but strong. He didn't need to say anything, and neither did she. The river kept flowing, the forest kept standing, and their lives moved forward, shaped by the past but not bound by it. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered as a reminder of what they had faced together. Her journey was no longer about escape or survival. It was about belonging, about choosing her path, and about standing beside those who had stood for her. The world beyond might still stir with conflict, but here, beneath the canopy of trees and the endless sky, she had found her place. And in that quiet, steady truth, the story found its natural end.